that they have a handle on the big picture, on the policy issues facing the UN development system. And I want to emphasize that. And they also have the nuts and bolts of the system. They understand the nuts and bolts in the system. Believe me, that's a rare combination in our information overloaded world. So we are fortunate to have all our speakers. Opening the webinar today is our colleague colleague Halvor Sætre. There is a small change in the sequencing of the speakers. So Halvor Sætre will be opening the webinar. He's the director from the section for UN policy at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Halvor Sætre will be followed by Jens Wandel, who in fact needs no introduction. Jens Wandel is the Secretary General's designate who's leading the COVID-19 fund. And he is also the advisor to the Secretary General on UN reforms. Before I hand over to Halvor, a piece of practical information. Time is of essence in a webinar. And of course, it's of essence in the crisis, in managing crisis also, as we will hear later today when it comes to COVID-19. So time permitting, we will be opening up for questions. So please be brief, and we will be opening up for written questions. And we will pose your questions to the right addressee. Most of these questions, we are thinking that they would come after the discussion, the panel discussion. But again, depending on time, we might have the time for taking a couple of questions after Halvor Sætre and Jens Wandel's presentation. So without taking any more time, let's roll. So over to Halvor Sætre.
Thank you so much, Balbir. And let me just say how pleased I am and that we are to co-host this webinar with the evaluation department in Norad, because this work has been a truly cooperative exercise between Foreign Ministry and Norad from the start until this day, and we hope that that continues. And I would just like to spend a few moments in taking us back to early March last year, when the world closed down and the depth of the pandemic began to set in. Because at that time, the public debate in most developed countries was primarily centered on how each country could protect itself. You remember how multilateralism was under pressure, and you all remember how geopolitics dominated discussions in the WHO, in and around the WHO. And in the MFA, while having to adapt to the virtual home-based work reality, work began in a number of areas to try to cope, try to deal with the situation from our perspective. And of course, building on our strong traditions in the global health field, our colleagues in the health department in the ministry were really busy working full steam from the first moment. And the same thing with our humanitarian colleagues, who are also usually seized up very early in crisis mode. So then in the UN section, the section where I am in, we started asking ourselves how we could contribute based on our role, which is more of the broader promotion of multilateral responses through the UN, the more systemic approach, the UN development system, etc. And we asked, what about the broader socioeconomic consequences in developing countries that would not be immediately addressed by the WHO-led response or the humanitarian response? And what about the UN system's ability to adapt and support countries in such dramatic situations? All those countries in the developing world that we didn't hear so much about at that time in Norwegian press, for instance. So, we saw also through our dialogue with several of these countries, we were actually running a campaign for Norway's seat on the Security Council, and we had extensive dialogue with all countries on the planet, even the very small ones, the small island development states, and developing states, and we really heard that how worried they were that they had suddenly lost all financial income, yet they didn't qualify for a humanitarian emergency, or they really didn't have one registered case of COVID-19. So this is something that started developing. And since we have this UN backbone in our section, I think it's this more or less the same backbone that Jens has, that we always see, this response through a systemic approach. And we had obviously worked really hard on the reforms of the UN system, and we were very proud of those results that we had achieved. So that was kind of the reason why we started discussing the possibility that the UN created a multi-partner trust fund for this crisis. And we started to float the idea, and we proposed it to our ministers, and they quickly accepted it. It became part of the speaking notes that they gave interviews every day. And then our ambassador spoke to Amina Mohammed about it, and suddenly it found its way to the New York Times and Al Jazeera because our prime minister had been interviewed. So, and then suddenly all focus was on us in our little section, and we had to kind of explain what was this fund about, and how would it distinguish itself between the humanitarian action and the health action. So we were a little burdened there a couple of days, but thankfully the idea kind of came through. The Secretary General announced the fund on 31st of March. We had our first sigh of relief because we kind of stuck our neck out, right? And then the SG agreed. He set up the fund, or he communicated that it would be set up. And then the wheels on the 38th floor in New York were moving quickly, we understand. And we were very, very pleased. It's no secret that we were very, very pleased when we heard that our good friend Jens had been nominated designate of that fund. And that was the second sigh of relief. And then, then it's kind of like, it's a matter of history, and we will hear more about it today. But I just remember, and I appreciate fond memories of those discussions that we had early on, Jens, when we didn't have a map of this fund. It was just basically a concept, and we started discussing also how Norway could support, and we secured funding internally in our system, because obviously we knew that we had to come through having stuck our neck out. And also we decided to be a part of this actively from day one. And Norad responded extremely rapidly by actually, taking on the management of this funding. And we joined the advisory committee. And then as a kind of final really part of the puzzle from Norway's side was that Norad, you guys, on your own, decided to kind of promote this early lessons exercise that we're discussing today. So this all came together very nicely. And for me, 4 key words about what has kind of been the success of the fund, and I will start coming in for landing, so don't worry, Balbir. Leadership and partnership has been key. Clear strategic direction has been absolutely necessary. Speed and innovation, and then a willingness to listen, to adapt, and to learn. For me, these 4 criteria kind of sums up how we managed to make a success of this fund. And none of these features would have been possible without the strong and yet very inclusive, pragmatic leadership of Jens Lande. And, as you said, I think it kind of was a stroke of genius that you could combine this deep knowledge of the system. I think you brought that with you, and you had access to the top floor in the secretariat, really. And you also had access and credibility with all the heads of the agencies. And you brought them in, you persuaded them. I don't know what you told them, but you managed to get them all in. And the other stroke of genius was that you could combine this role as designate with your role as a top advisor to the Secretary General on the reforms. And I think that's really a lot of the reason why we are here today, and that we have a smile on our face when we start this discussion. So this was kind of my introduction to you, Jens, and over to you, I think, or Balbir, if you want to be the moderator.
Balbir, I just need to check with you. My understanding is that this segment here is to finish around 8:30 my time. So I need to be relatively brief. Is that correct? You're muted, Albion.
You had a question.
Yeah, no, I was just asking on the timing.
Yeah, I was thinking of between 5 to 10 minutes. Is that all right for you?
That's perfect. But let me simply pick up from where Halvor, in a sense, set the scene. Let me add a little more to the situation. The situation was that we had been here before on Ebola, but Ebola really covered 6 countries. And when it happened, the UN was really not fit for purpose. In other words, we had to stand up a department under Ebola to deal with the coordination on the development side. WHO was really not functioning well at the time in the emergency setting, etc. We had done the reform, and there in around 7, 8, 9 March, when these discussions really shaped up, it became quite clear that we could use the existing structures. Now, from where we were, the first thing we had to do is, before we even got to the fund, was we had to make sure that the United Nations could deliver. And for any organization that is faced with a global pandemic, you just need to have a few functions ready: capacity to pay, capacity to procure, capacity to hire, capacity to transport yourself around, and capacity to protect your own staff. If you have those 5 capacities, you can operate. And we knew around 22nd March, we had all 5 capacities in place. So then came the next issue. Now we have the tools. Do we have the capacity to program? And the other part is, just to summarize, Halvor, your point is that we realized that the pandemic hit countries economically, and some of the countries may never be hit by the pandemic. That turned out not to be correct later, because we found out that everybody had the pandemic, and then they start spinning. And today we talk about first, second, and third wave. And those years we didn't know in the beginning. We could just see it was extremely bad. And some of those countries that were hit socioeconomically, they were totally in panic. I had foreign ministers and finance ministers calling me personally, asking me what to do. Now, the key to setting up the fund was, under the reform, we'll set up the resident coordinator system. And the resident coordinator system was equipped with 4 to 5 staff, professional staff, who do not do day-to-day programming. And that means we could hit that layer and then get that layer to organize the response. And that's exactly what happened. The Secretary General created a framework for socioeconomic, you can say, analysis. And then what happened, some of the resident coordinators who are trained in emergency response, they flipped the analysis to what is known today as the socioeconomic response plans. They were not centrally decided. They happened in the system as part of the learning. What happened was that we saw that in August, 4th of August, I had meeting with the resident coordinators, and they showed me the first plans. I immediately could see that those plans, they solved a major problem for the fund. So let me take you back. We are in April. We got 60 million, thanks to you, Norway, and Holland, and others. And we needed to get the money out because the system had to act. Everybody else were paralyzed. And we got it out. And then I had to shield it so we did not we deconflicted with Mark Lowcott's OCHA. So I took all the countries out that were part of the emergency response. And then I also took some criteria about LDC, because at that time I could not do a needs-based allocation. So I had to use poverty as proxy for need. And then what also happened was that we stood up the fund. 31st March, it was declared. And by end of April, we had the call out and the money in. And by around 20 May, roughly 7 weeks later, we got approximately 60 million out through the door. Now, I could never have done that if we had not stood up an advisory committee to me as Designate. And just to speak plain English, when you are a Designate, you decide. because it's an emergency. So therefore it's not a board, it's an advisory committee. But it was a very senior committee, and Halvor, you were there and others were there. And we met every week. Normally boards do not meet every week, but we met every week to co-create the response. And once you do it that way, then things become higher quality because everybody contribute in a way. And then the other thing that you did not see, Halvor, etc. I know most of the resident coordinators personally, and I called them, so we co-created the call. And that means that those who received the call, when they received the call, they already knew the structure of the call. And we have been very careful to calibrate timeliness with transaction costs and still quality. In the first call, a couple of things did not go well. Number one is that it was very rushed. Secondly, we did not hit the gender dimension in the call correctly. And thirdly, that the prioritization was a proxy because we did not have really an action framework. But nevertheless, it turned out later, and we found that in the evaluation that the first call projects, they were quite good, but they had one very important impact, and that is it allowed the resident coordinator to go to the government and act. And that thing alone led to many, many, many other positive things. And as one of them told me actually a couple of days back, they said, Jens, the money was very small, but they were the only money in town. So, therefore, that makes a huge difference. And then, okay, then back to August now. Then we got the socioeconomic framework. There were 44 frameworks ready at that time, but not fully ready. And then I announced, and then I did not work through any other structure inside the UN. I spoke directly to the resident coordinators. And then I consulted with them and told them, we will need a framework, because if I have the socioeconomic response plans, I can then do it on a needs-based. I can simply see what are the most important needs in the countries. But only 44 out of 130 countries is not a good one. So we decided, and I communicated, that for the next call, which was going out in September, only countries which had socioeconomic response plans ready, they would be eligible for the call. So we moved from 44 SERPs to having 110 SERPs. And the other trick was, because the Secretary General's reform is about transparency, they had to be published to the internet. And I know now that internal process also created a lot of, you can say some frustrations, but it created a lot of positive, because then people were forced to work together, and they had a goal that is, we must publish this and then set priorities. And it is 101 in capital formation that if you can get a group to publish a framework and set priorities within that framework, you have created a very action-oriented team. And yes, there were 10, 15 countries that couldn't do it. And we should not allocate money to them, because most likely they couldn't implement either. Then, not to take too long, what is that we achieved? We got roughly to 80 countries. We have impacted roughly 24 million people. But we have derived a couple of things. Call the gender dimension was simply brought in aggressively at a level that has never been tried in these type of interventions before. And there was nervousness whether we at the country level had the capacity, and that was a good concern. So we stood up in 10 days, UN-based gender training, and they covered nearly 500 staff. And this training was not mandatory, it was voluntarily. I wrote to the resident coordinator, say, if you need this training, take it. I am guaranteeing you it's high quality. It had 500 participants. Then we could also see that certain things like digitization suddenly became a no-brainer. We could just see it show up. And we could also see leave no one behind became kind of a mantra. And we could also see that the building back better concept, moving to the SDGs, was a meaningful concept. So that means that even while we had to react in this situation, we could discuss SDG. And I'm a development practitioner. And therefore, my experience is that when these things happen, and I tell you, it looked very dangerous from many countries' point of view over the summer last year. When these things happen, and then the United Nations act, it gives courage, and it gives credibility on many things. Finally, we did a formal evaluation because it was necessary to find out whether there were lessons, because we knew damn well that this thing is not over. And secondly, if we had to continue, which we do, if there were lessons to be adapted, we need to know them. And that means we accelerated the evaluation. And again, we could see that the evaluation team were able to understand the situation, manage the scope to the situation, and then deliver a meaningful report. However, recommendation 6 in that report is we need a more thorough evaluation going forward, which is totally logical, and that I will confirm that is totally accepted on the part of the UN. But nevertheless, going in and understanding that when we act in these unknown territory of very, very deep threat to us, then it's important that we bring in evaluation and test whether we can be evaluated. In other words, is the documentation, is the logic there? Is this something that works, or is it just something we're cooking up? So I could speak for a long time, but I will just close by saying one other lasting effect of this has been that the term development emergency has arrived to stay. And the development emergency, you could say, why do we need that? That's because the COVID was a development emergency. This thing where this virus doesn't play by the rules, so therefore it doesn't first infect people and make them poor. It makes them poor, and then it affects them afterwards, and then it makes them poorer, and then they politically go unstable and they can't vaccinate, and we need to be able to intervene in countries that are still developing, but they are becoming, their social fabric is disintegrating because of a threat like this. And I have been doing business in this type of business since 1988. We do not, even when 30 years back, have never seen anything like this. And bringing development emergency, showing speed and resolve is part of a stress test of the UN system. And therefore it's also, it proves that the reform actually stood up a system that could react. One final word, Balbi, and then I'll stop. Outside the fund, the United Nations stood up from April to June a worldwide medical evacuation system that covered not only the UN, but covered all the large international NGOs. That has not been evaluated, but believe you me, this has had a dramatic impact for both the UN and all the other co-actors, you can say, because they stayed and delivered. I have heard the CEO of Plan International confirming this in public meetings. And I think this is another area that sits outside this conversation, but we should take a look at. It was unprecedented, and it's very logical. If you sit on an airplane, you're always told, put the mask over your face and then help your children afterwards. The United Nations could never have done anything if we did not have ability to protect our staff. Let me stop here and hand back to you. And I do have a little more time if you need me to stay on.
Okay. Thank you very much for your contribution. Before now, I'm in that time which was for my presentation, so I'm cutting into my time. So, but I won't let you go without one question. So, one short question, 2 minutes. We have to answer that. The question is there one thing that you think you could have done differently in thinking retrospectively, or which also has an implication for way forward?
There was one thing we didn't achieve, and that is that it was very hard to persuade the system that this situation would require a significant reallocation of resources. So therefore, the United Nations funding system is extremely fragmented. And when the evaluation is done in 2020 on disbursement, I know for a fact that many of the sources of fund, they could not disperse. And that means that we had capital locked up in so-called development, and that capital should have been reallocated and framed into the development emergency. That conversation was not possible. Institutional, there were too many barriers, but also financially, there were too many agreements. Things were locked in small funds and projects. And finally, at least into over the summer, The most people I spoke from the development system, they were sure that this thing will be over for Christmas. And it was so obvious it was not. But most people wished it away or misunderstood it. And it is a regret, but it also points to a huge weakness in the system.
Thank you very much for the short answer. I think I'll go on to doing the presentation. And just before that, I mean, one of the most effective presentations were made in the form of 10 bullet points on a single slide. So I'm mortal. I'll be using about 2-3 slides to do justice to the report. Well, a lot of the findings confirm what was mentioned earlier in the presentation today. We looked at this fund, as you all know, it is about important fund. It's the fourth. Okay, the fund is important. The objective of the fund is important. There is no doubt about it. It's about both the crisis and the crisis after the crisis. And it's the fourth largest fund, MPTF fund in the MPTF portfolio. And what is special about this fund is, as was mentioned earlier, that it has been developed in the context of the UN development systems reform. I can just say very few things. I'll focus on few things here. And that is, I'll say something about what are the main takeaways for achievement so far, where is it that we slipped, and what are the lessons we can get out of this. Well, as far as the takeaways are concerned, there are basically the most two important ones, which have already been mentioned, are the timing part of it's the timing and how the fund benefited from the UN reform. And keep in mind that the fund also benefited the UN reform itself. So they were mutually beneficial outcomes. Between, as Halvor also mentioned, how work was done at different levels and in different fora, in different formats, which led to that from between March, when the whole initiative started, and by end of April, early May, we had the fund going. Trust funds, what we know from earlier, are not really known for speed. Well, this trust fund managed it. And there's something to learn about that here. The other mutual benefit was, I call it a mutual benefit, that as was mentioned, that the resident coordinator system was there, the United Nations country teams were there. So that benefited the implementation of the fund. But there's another way around also. The fund strengthened the reform. It empowered the Office of the Resident Coordinator. It strengthened the smaller UN agencies, as this one was about coming with a coordinated response from the UN. And there was, in addition to the main bigger agencies, there we saw a good participation of the smaller agencies as well. These are sort of some of the takeaways as regards the achievements. I'm sure we'll come back to them in the discussion panel as well. Back to what are the issues that need to be addressed. Well, as was mentioned earlier here, local involvement in development of projects was good as far as the UN development system was concerned. But the evaluation does point out to that the involvement of for example, the local NGOs or involvement of the local authorities could have been strengthened. So that's something that we can take ahead as we move forward. There is a potential for greater involvement of small UN agencies. These are agencies, they do not necessarily have sort of country level presence, and more, that is something which we can strengthen. Although that the evaluation does point out their involvement so far, but there is a potential for improvement there. The next thing is the fund it's not the resources do not have, it lacks the critical mass to be a game changer for interagency cooperation. There is a need for more funding, and there is a need to for more emphasis on this interagency cooperation, both to realize the objectives of the fund, but also to realize the full potential of the UN reform itself. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier also, the UN infrastructure, which was there, the organizational infrastructure, that has benefited the fund so far. It has led to a quick response. But as we move forward to deliver sustainable and equitable or green reconstruction that towards the 2030 agenda, we need something more. We need to do something more. And what is it that we can do? Well, what we learned from this fund is that the timely and prompt response to crisis requires organization at the country level. And this fund, because of the UN reform, the fund had the benefit of that organization at the country level. Then, if we are talking about UN, we need to have broad participation from UN agencies to get the potential out of the UN reform also. We need to develop, now this broad participation means small agencies also. Well, how do we get them in? Well, there we can do something about creating a level field for small UN organizations, which means more allocation mechanisms in the fund, which are transparent, equitable, and include allocation. I mentioned that the critical mass of funding is not there to be a game changer when it comes to cooperation between the agencies. Well, we need to, having the critical mass is one thing, but having the right incentives with whatever resources are there, the evaluation or early lessons points out a potential there. We need to develop strengthen incentives to create a culture of interagency cooperation. Need to supplement the current UN framework and the economic, the plans at the country level. They have functioned well so far, contributed to fast getting off the track. But we will need some concrete guidelines for UN policy engagement at the country level to really sort of influence better, greener, and equitable reconstruction. Lastly, often crisis, we forget those core values. But what this fund shows that the way it has functioned so far, it is possible to integrate gender, human rights, sustainable development principles of leave no one behind in crisis situations also. Although a lot was done in this fund, and there more can be done there. So these are some of the lessons which are of relevance, not just for this fund, but they are also relevance for other funds or as we move forward towards the 2030. We have done our memo to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and we don't have very many recommendations. There are a lot of recommendations in the report itself. So we have basically two recommendations, and those go on, of course, that we support the recommendations in the report, and we need to do something more than that. And that is, the fund at the current point needs to prioritize this real-time learning that we have done so far. And this is just the sort of a prelude. We need a real-time evaluation going ahead in this fund as well. And this evaluation, again, I would emphasize that funds come and go. But what we are also looking at in this evaluation is the whole the UN reform and the infrastructure that has been established. And of course, the evaluation should be system-wide. Each agency has very competent evaluation units and report to their own boards. But there is always a need to ask the question, what is UN delivering as one? So I will stop there, and we have That was a sort of more to the appetite, to build the appetite for the discussion. We have three. The next on the agenda is the discussion panel. We have three competent participants in the panel. Perhaps I will leave the introduction of our three competent panel members to them. Each one of them has 5 minutes to pitch their point, and I would request each member to perhaps start off with what question they are addressing in their message. So over to the panel. Masa, you are the first one on the panel. Would you like to take over?
Okay. Thank you, and thank you for not introducing me. I'm Masa Igarashi. I'm currently chair of United Nations Evaluation Group, which covers over 50 UN agency evaluation units and entities. And I'm also the director of evaluation in Food and Agriculture Organization of FAO, of the United Nations, which is FAO. So I'm addressing today the question about how UNEG, the United Nations Evaluations Group, could support the way forward in this endeavor. So I will focus on what does COVID experience taught us in this regard. It showed us the importance of working together to provide coherent support, not only among UN system agencies, but also with the government and other development partners. And I would like to dig a bit deeper on this from the evaluator's perspective. Since the turn of the century, the international development community has been trying to support nationally driven development processes towards agreed goals, be it MDGs or SDGs or SERPs. This was a departure from the past assistance, where a development intervention was designed in isolation to produce its outputs, outcomes, and impact by itself, as long as the external condition was right. So new ways required us to look at how different forces and processes are at work, leading to the achievement of policy goals, and work together for that purpose. So evaluators needed more than a simple logical framework used for the traditional model. So we brought in systems approach. Let me give you briefly the example of this. How do I share the screen? Let me just do. Okay. So I just share the screen to show you what the systems approach looked like. And this is what we used in our evaluation of nutrition target of SDGs in our evaluation. So just let's stop share now. This map showed the intersectoral synergies and trade-offs and embedded in the system that created dynamic processes with a degree of unpredictability. This is too complex to analyze in its entirety, nor can it be used practically to measure the effects of individual interventions. No one is expected to understand the entire system. So what should we do? My proposition is to take an adaptive approach in programming and real-time approach in evaluations. We regularly monitor the progress and choose the best course of action as we go. COVID-19 response has been a good example of dealing with such multi-sectoral complexity. There are clear trade-offs between containing the virus on the one hand and keeping the economy going on the other. The pandemic, as well as the measure to counter it, affected people in different ways and to varying degrees, creating dynamic processes that we cannot predict. No one can analyze all of the policy effects in such a situation, be it a lockdown or easing of restrictions. Experts on infectious disease have their opinions, economists and sociologists have theirs. And at the end of the day, politicians make a call based on the advice of various sectoral experts. In doing so, the politicians should also be able to draw on results-based monitoring data, rates of infection, deaths, hospital capacity, for instance, and the plethora of socioeconomic indicators. It is also important that decision makers get the analysis of why certain data have gone up or down so as to take an informed judgment. This adaptive approach has been a natural reaction for many countries in the world during the COVID-19 pandemic in the face of huge multi-sectoral complexity and unpredictability. This is actually what evaluators are supposed to do: look at the data and evidence, focus on results indicators, analyze the causal relationship behind them, and provide evidence-based policy advice. Such an approach is more prevalent so far in humanitarian actions because of the unpredictability of many humanitarian crises, as well as their frequently multi-sectoral nature of the impact of the crisis. But why not do the same for development initiatives? Indeed, COVID-19 response has been both humanitarian and development, and both areas are merging. To make this new approach work, we need managers at all levels in all sectors to embrace it. A focus on results, regular monitoring and analysis, learning and adaptation. This cannot be the responsibility of evaluators alone. It must involve the whole organization and the whole system.
Masa, we're going into
yes,
Silke's time, and I can see that Silke is wondering when is she coming on. So if you can be a bit...
It is a challenge that evaluation officers can help organizations tackle, and very much a new task on our horizon. National evaluation capacity and systems are also important. I hope that we in UNEC can build up a common front to promote such evaluation culture within and outside our organizations and our partners, Norad including, of course, to support and join this front. Thank you.
Thank you, Masa. But adapt and learn, and real-time learning, that is what something we are going in the direction of from your side. Silke, you're the next one.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. My name is Silke Weinlich. I'm a senior researcher at the German Development Institute, which is an independent research institute and a think tank based in Bonn, Germany. I have been following UNDS reform in various capacities. I've been part of the quality assurance of this early lessons study. I've also been part of an expert group of a study by the Multilateral Performance Assessment Network, which has had a different focus, more on the UNDS reforms and not so much on the COVID-19 response. But I was asked to answer in 5 minutes the questions: what challenges and opportunities I see in the UN reform when we look at the lessons from the MOPAN study and also the UN study on the early lessons from the COVID-19 MPTF. And I'll come right to the point. I see one main challenge and 2 opportunities emerging from the evidence that was brought out by the 2 reports. First of all, both studies show that there has been a really impressive progress in many areas of the reform in a time frame of about 2 years, right? So that has also been described in detail by the Secretary General in the recent RC review report. I cannot detail them here. Balbir has also highlighted some of them. But it is also clear that the progress in the reform is still very fragile. Support for the reform has not reached all staff at all levels across all UN entities. And despite structural changes, and cooperation and coherence still mean an extra effort and have high transaction costs. And also, it's not always clear that the extra efforts really pays out, that cooperation yields results which are sort of larger than what individual UN entities can do or what they could be doing sort of working next to each other. So how can we overcome the fragility of the reform process? The first challenge, or the first point I have, is we need to make way better use of the carrots and the sticks. And it's mostly member states that need to do that. And when I talk about carrots, I mean funding. And when I talk about sticks, I mean governance. And the big question really is, are member states willing and able to translate their reform commitment, which they have shown over time and over again at the ECOSOC and in the General Assembly, into whole of government approaches across governing bodies of different UN entities, really to reinforce the strong message that the UN Secretary General has been sending about the reform. And when I say member states, this does not only mean donor countries, it's really a question of all member states who have to become more consistent across governing boards, which have much more authority about what UN entities do than the Secretary General actually can exert. And the second question related is, are they willing and able to translate their reform commitment into a significantly changed supply of entity-specific resources and also of demands for entity-specific support, right? So it's a supply and demand side to it, which really goes all down to all levels of ministries and embassies. And this is the problem of earmarked funding, right? How can we really shift funding towards bringing the UN development system together and not driving it apart? Funding is a central risk to the reforms. In particular, the MOPAN report has pointed this out, but also the UN study. Funding, and in particular, the lack of sustainable funding also for the RC system is endangering and also limiting the progress. So currently, negotiations are ongoing about finding a sustainable solution to the RC system funding. And that will, I think, first be the first litmus test. And with this outlining of the challenges, I come to the two opportunities. I think overcoming the challenge and sort of making UNDS reform more robust is really worth it. This is also something that the two reports have provided evidence for. The reforms are working. They are propelling the system in the right direction. The question is it going fast enough? Is it going deep enough? But it is going into the right direction. And two opportunities stick out for me. First, there are important lessons to be learned from working together during the COVID response crisis, or during the COVID crisis. This is something that both MOPAN and the UN study really call for. It has helped very much for UN country teams to have a global socioeconomic response strategy. It created a shared imperative with a clear focus. And that was the same holds true for the SERPs, which provide a coherent, cohesive, and transparent plan for UN country teams. UN country teams have found other ways of working together, as Jens pointed out, which might provide interesting future ways of bringing in non-resident agencies or of putting together project proposals and also dividing up resources. So first thing is learn lessons from the COVID crisis, which really also helped the UN to come together. The second opportunity is that it is really good, it's important to make more use of pooled funds. Although the COVID-19 fund and many of the other funds are small, there are no game changers, as Balbir said, they really serve as a lever for both making the UN entities work better together, but also for more innovative policies and better results. Be it the COVID-19 MPTF, be it the Peacebuilding Fund, the Joint SDG Fund, they all help UNCTs really to embark on cooperation, and they incentivize innovation, risk-taking, shifting towards what's required by the 2030 agenda. The reforms also call for a repositioning, for changing functions of the UNDS, which cannot sort of come through business as usual. They need more investment, and the pooled funds are helping there. Jens also mentioned the cross-cutting topics, gender, LNOB, human rights, and all this can be incentivized and brought in to a much better degree through the pooled funds. Volume is an issue, of course. There has been a call for the merger of the SDG fund and the joint and the COVID-19 response fund. And of course, when you look at the funding compact commitments, the capitalization of the SDG fund and the Peacebuilding Fund are far off what has been committed to. But I think in general, if we seizing both opportunities, sort of learning lessons from the COVID crisis and what worked well, and learning or making use of MPTFs will be really paramount to speed up the UNDS repositioning and to push it forward in a manner that is called for when we look at the COVID pandemic and the third and the fourth and hopefully not a fifth wave, and also the 9 years left of the decade of action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Silke. We have. I think we'll go on to Matthew. Matthew, we have total 8 minutes left for this webinar. So if you can keep yourself brief, I'd like to bring in Halvor Sætre before we go on to the closing. So go ahead, Matthew.
Thank you, Balbir. I'll be very, very brief. First, greetings from the Executive Office of the Secretary General, where I am the Senior Coordinator for System-Wide Evaluation. Secondly, I want to say a big appreciation for the Norad Evaluation Office for the support and being part of the system-wide evaluation of the early lessons. Your both funding as well as technical support, the substantive being a party to it really helped, and something to deliver an evaluation report of the scale and breadth and with so many agencies involved in a few months is very difficult. We had to any evaluation report has to hardwire to keep policy decision. And I tell you that we managed to put it into the Secretary General's report just on the last day of his report getting out to all the member states. That was a major achievement to get it done. Thanks to Norad for the continued participation in that. Two small things which I see as we go forward to the next phase of the main evaluation. And one is upstream policy. A lot of claims are being made by the UN system on influencing upstream policies in the countries. COVID basically showed us when it put countries to test how politics and policy failures again and again, and whether the UN system can actually influence good upstream policy in many areas. And that is something that we would like to make sure that we capture in the next evaluation. We also want to make sure, number one, that the world has changed and evaluation has to change. We cannot continue to go on as before. There are many new things that needs to be put into place within the new normal, and evaluation has to follow those things too. Be real time to show the policymakers what really worked and what did not work. We would like to make sure that there is a, molding of policy practitioners in evaluation while evaluators think independently. And without that, and discussions such as this actually help. And we want to make sure that the policymakers are equally engaged in the evaluation and inclusive process, and to do it fast, in good time to feed into and hotwire that. I will stop now. And thank you, Balbir, for organizing this.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for your views. And Halvor, Setra, if you have a few comments before we go in for closing, we have about 5 minutes left.
Thank you so much. I'll be very brief, Balbir. No, just thank you, all of you, for all your contributions. I think there's a lot of convergence in thinking here. We are certainly very persuaded that it is wise to move on with this approach where we have this real-time evaluation, thinking methodology that actually helps us learn as we go. And I think that's really something that this has shown. And also, obviously, we are really continue to be very committed to the reforms. And as Silke said, we agree to many of the challenges and opportunities that you mentioned, and certainly we are working as much as we can to avoid the risks here and to try to take some of the opportunities. And as regards the pool funds, I mean, we are really, as you understand, really committed to pool funds, and we believe in them, as this exercise has shown. But we tried to do a lot of outreach to other big donors. We got there was response from many, also from quite some small countries, which is very positive. But we didn't manage to get some of the other big ones on board. And it's not for a lack of trying, but we are certainly convinced about this. And just finally, before we also agree to the carrot and stick approach that we need to be consistent across the board. Just also the idea about the gender marker, because I think that was really something that was innovative in this fund, and that we should certainly bring forward. That we managed to, thanks to having UN Women actively on board in the advisory committee, they were spearheading very, very solid methodology for this. And I really think that that's something that we should bring on in other funds and other processes across the board.
Okay.
And I can also just say that we are now at 84 million committed dollars for this fund, not 70. So it's going a little forward. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Halvor. We have, I will just ask our web coordinator, if Shasti Loken, if she could bring on Bernard Suland, your colleague from Swiss Development Corporation. In the meantime, while you're doing that, we can go on to, I would hand over now to our evaluation director, Håvard Nygård. Håvard, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Balbir. So first of all, I would just like to thank everyone for an extremely stimulating and interesting discussion. And both thank you to our panel, our presenters, and to the participants, the audience as well. So obviously recovering from this pandemic and figuring out how to build back greener and better is very much a pressing priority. We need to figure out how to do that right. And this report gives us the first pieces of data we need to ensure that we are indeed doing it right. A concrete recommendation for a follow-up to this study is to implement a real-time evaluation, which has already been mentioned, of the fund to support future operations. Our department, the evaluation department, represented by my esteemed colleague Balbir, is currently working with the Secretary General's office to develop the terms of reference for such a study. I very much hope that that project can be realized and that the current draft terms of reference can be used to mobilize sufficient support and buy-in from other donors and across the system. For our part, we've recommended to, I guess, to Halvor and to the Norwegian MFA that the lessons learned from this study should be used to inform future Norwegian engagements with and support for UN COVID-19 responses at the country level. We also recommend that Norway use its seat on the advisory committee for the fund to work to ensure that the future operations of the fund take the important lessons and recommendations of the report into account. As has been mentioned, the evaluation department is both eager and ready and looking forward to continue to work with and contribute to the implementation of this real-time evaluation. We believe this will be an important tool for learning that can be used to improve and inform the future work, the future UN work to support recovery at the country level. So on that note, thank you to everyone and stay safe.
And we have one, we had some interesting questions, but time, like I said in the beginning, is of essence, and we apologize for not being able to bring everyone on. But I have Bernard Suland from the Swiss Development Corporation, who he just has to unmute to come up with his input. Are you there, Bernard?
Yes, thank you very much. Baldur, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Perfect. So good morning and good afternoon. My name is Bernard Suland. I work for the Global Institutions Division of the Swiss Development Corporation in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I would just like to put this evaluation in the broader frame of the aim for the UN system-wide evaluation. For that, I'm referring to the statement Switzerland delivered on behalf of several member states at the ECOSOC operational activity segment. And in this statement, we welcome the SG's initiative to establish an independent system-wide evaluation office. We appreciate the lessons learned and evaluability exercise as a first initiative of the system-wide evaluation office, which is also the first to assess the UNTS response from a system-wide approach. In the statement, we also expressed our view that this study provides highly valuable and useful findings on the fund's implementation and performance, and shows how the RC system, as a key element of the UNDS reform, has enabled coherent and collective action of the UNCTs. In addition, it identified room for improvement and approaches in order to further enhance the UNDS reform progress. And we share the Secretary General's conclusion that this first exercise has reaffirmed the need and the value of an independent system-wide evaluation office that is fully equipped to assess the system's collective support to the Sustainable Development Goals. And now, again, speaking from the Swiss perspective, the planned COVID-19 evaluation serves, in addition to the conclusions regarding the COVID-19 response and recovery and the UNDS reform progress, it serves also as the pilot for independent system-wide evaluations, aiming to demonstrate the added value of independent system-wide evaluations, and therefore further strengthening and the legitimacy and acceptance of the independent system-wide evaluation office. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Solon, and thank you all for participating. And once again, we just had this hour and we are over that. We've tried to do justice to both the topic and the subject matter today. Stay safe. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.